When most people think of the American Revolution, they think of Massachusetts, the battles of Lexington and Concord, perhaps the Battle of Boston, or maybe Virginia and the Battle of Yorktown, or some of the other big battles that occurred during the war. Very few people consider what happened in Westchester County that was basically on the front lines of the war for the entire war. Now that brings me to the McDonald Papers. Now, I know it sounds like something that involves Ray Kroc, the CIA, and some international conspiracy, but it was basically a book written by a man by the name of John McDonald. What he did in the 19th century was interview 241 people between the ages of 74 and 96 who had lived through the American Revolution, or a portion of it. And now the Westchester County Historical Society has digitized all the interviews and put them online, and they are searchable. If you're a history buff or you just like really good stories, I encourage you to visit the Westchester County Historical Society's website and start reading them. They give fascinating insight into the American Revolution, and I was waiting to produce my next video until these were available and I could search them, because it was really all about neutral ground. Today, Westchester County is one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. 250 years ago, Westchester included the Bronx. Now today, the Bronx is a borough, but it is also a standalone county. According to the 1790 census, the population combined was roughly 24 to 26,000. Today, Westchester County and the Bronx have a combined population somewhere between 2.4 and 2.5 million people, substantially more than the 24 to 26,000 people it had back in 1790. The landscape has also changed very dramatically, especially in the Bronx with rapid urbanization. Now, the Bronx does have some suburban areas to the east and west, but the county is mostly urban. Westchester County also has its city centers: White Plains, Portchester, Yonkers, New Rochelle. But Westchester also still has some horse farms, so there is a touch of the old Westchester County still here. Of course, Westchester County is one of the wealthiest counties in the nation, and it is famous for its wealthy areas such as Scarsdale, Bronxville, Harrison, Rye. You get the point. So take yourself back 250 years. Try to picture what this area was like during the American Revolution. We are back on Valentine Hill in Yonkers, and if you recall from an earlier episode, Washington sent General Charles Lee up to Westchester County to reconnoiter the geography and kind of figure out how to defend up here. The first thing he did was set this area for the headquarters of Washington. And the reason being, it was a classic strategical move of taking the high ground, because Valentine Hill offers a commanding view of most of the lower portion of the county. Much less so today with all the houses up here, but back in 1776 it certainly did. Now, the British also recognized this fact, and throughout the war, it was frequently the headquarters of the British. Have you ever wondered how streets get their name?
Emmerich kept his headquarters mostly at and under Dennis Valentine's Hill, at Vermalley's house. Sometimes he was quartered at Tedard's house, both before and after it was burned down.
Oh, I remember the Queen's Rangers and the Legion, which lay at different times near Valentine's Hill.
In that clip, we just heard about the Queen's Rangers. Now, the Queen's Rangers were a reconstitution of Rogers Rangers from the French and Indian War, and they were pretty much a special forces unit that adopted some of the Native American fighting techniques And during the French and Indian War, there were 2 units of Stockbridge Indians who fought with them. And some of these very same men would face off against their old unit at the Battle of Kingsbridge, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later in this video. Now, the Queens Rangers garnered quite the reputation for burning Patriot homes throughout the neutral zone, which is today Westchester County.
Very difficult area. You know, we were caught between the armies. You know, the British have good positions south of here. The Americans have decent positions north of here. And you got, is it a 6 to 8 mile, you know, zone in the middle, sometimes called neutral ground or no man's land, where you don't have huge battles here, but what you have is an area caught between warring parties. So that middle zone becomes, like, unfortunately, ripe territory for raids, sometimes big, sometimes small, on the civilian population, foraging parties coming through. The key was nobody was in control.
And I am standing in front of one of the most important historic houses in Westchester County. This is the Ward House. It is located on White Plains Road in Eastchester, New York. And in 1776, the house that stood here prior was owned by Stephen Ward, who was one of the most important Patriot leaders in the county. He was town supervisor of Eastchester. It's believed he was also one of the Sons of Liberty, and he was a member of the Provincial Congress. Now, in 1776, when it looked like Washington was going to lose New York and have to retreat, Stephen Ward took his family and left town. Then General Howe invaded Westchester County, and he decided to make the house here his headquarters during the Battle of White Plains. In November of 1778, the Queens Rangers under John Graves Simcoe burnt that house down. And then in mid-1790s, right around the time that Westchester Lodge 46 was founded, Jonathan Ward, Stephen Ward's son, rebuilt this house to the exact specifications. Jonathan Ward was one of the founding members of Westchester Lodge 46, and his brother Richard would go on to become the 4th master of our lodge. Most people enjoy works of Hollywood fiction, such as the movie The Patriot or the series Turn. Now, in both of those, there was a definitive bad guy. In The Patriot, it was a Colonel Tavington, and in the series Turn, it was John Graves Simcoe. Now, in that series, John Graves Simcoe is portrayed as being the biggest SOB in every conceivable way you can possibly imagine. The truth was far more complicated than that. John Graves Simcoe, after the war, became a politician, and they celebrate him up in Canada, and it's Simcoe Day. And the reason why they celebrate him is because, just like Lafayette, he pushed for the abolition of slavery, and he actually had that achieved in his area way ahead of the British Empire and the United States of America. He also pushed for trial by a jury of your peers, which is also something he was able to implement in his day. Now, John Graves Simcoe is a Masonic brother. He was raised in Union Lodge in Exeter back in 1773. In December of 1776, a young, aggressive, and ambitious cavalry officer and his fellow troops in a lightning raid would storm a tavern in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. There they would find and capture General Charles Lee, still in his nightshirt. Now, this is the incident that would make a name for Banastre Tarleton, and his reputation would only grow from there. Today, he is even referred to as Bloody Ban, and the Kingsbridge Massacre and he and the actions of his British Legion would certainly add to this notorious reputation of him. Now, the British Legion was a collection of cavalrymen and infantry and a little bit of artillery. They were known to be very fast, very mobile, and they would hit hard. In fact, they were one of the most effective units that the British would field during the American Revolution. Tarleton himself would hand select the horses, selecting the lightest and fastest horses he could find. When they would charge in battle, they would not use muskets. They would just simply charge in on horseback with their sabers and try and mow down the enemy. Banastre, after the war, would become a politician, much like John Graves Simcoe. The difference is John Graves Simcoe would fight for the abolition of slavery, but Banastre Tarleton had grown up in a family that made their fortune in the slave trade. So he would spend his years in Parliament fighting for the continuation of the slave trade. Banastre Tarleton is who Colonel Tavington from The Patriot is loosely based upon. and for a time he was stationed right here in Westchester. Now, you all recall that infamous scene in The Patriot where Colonel Tavington has a bunch of women and children and civilians locked in a church, and then he has his men burn the church. Now, that absolutely never happened during the American Revolution, and shame on Hollywood for implying that it had. It did happen during World War II when a Waffen-S group did this to civilians in France, but as far as it happening in the American Revolution, it never did. The closest thing that probably happened would be the burning of Bedford on July 11th, 1779, when a church was burnt. Fortunately, thanks to the McDonald Papers, we have some first-hand accounts of that. Now, in the past, this has been attributed to Banastre Tarleton. However, it wasn't them. It was the 17th Light Dragoons under a Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Birch. So let's listen to Nancy Sarles, who recounts the events of that day and her personal experience during the burning of Bedford.
In the Revolutionary War, my father lived in Bedford, a mile and a half from the village on the road to White Plains. His name was Israel Lyon, an active Whig and committee man. When Tarleton took Poundbridge, he set fire to Bedford Church, but it was extinguished and the church was not burned until Bedford was set fire to. The party consisted of several hundred, composed of leather caps and refugees, and all mounted. The refugees did all the mischief, plundering and burning, whilst the leather caps sat on horseback and kept their ranks. They were hungry when at our house, asking constantly for bread, and we gave all we had. They then set fire to our house and retreated. I endeavored to put the fire out and succeeded downstairs, but they had fired a bed upstairs, which I knew not of until it was too late. Just then, a party of our militia came to our assistance and helped to save some things in the house.
We are standing in front of the Philipse Manor Hall in downtown Yonkers, New York. Now, during the American Revolution, this was owned by Frederick Philipse III, who was one of the wealthiest men in Colonial New York. So much of the Philipse family wealth came from owning real estate. They would in turn rent that land out to tenant farmers. And not only did the Philipse family own a large portion of what is today Westchester County, they also owned a sizable amount of land up in Putnam County, hence Phillipstown in Putnam County. However, the ownership of the Putnam County land was under the Philipse patent, and that was under dispute.
Part of this arrangement was involved Adolph Philipse, who had been granted a part of the Hudson Valley in around 1700, and he was mostly concentrated in New York City and farther downstream in what is now Westchester County. So the Philipse Upper Patent, as it was called, what is now basically Putnam County, but between Westchester and Dutchess County, was not high on his list of priorities, and there was a lot of movement in there. A lot of Wappingers still lived in that territory, and they had not sold him the land. Their view was that he had only gotten some land from them in 1697, close to the river. He was claiming, or rather his heirs were claiming, that he had gotten all the land to the Connecticut line. And this is where the contest really emerged in the 1760s, when Adolph Philipse died in 1749 or 1750, and the men who married his daughters, along with his descendant Frederick Philipse, these were the people who began to want to develop in their own terms and on their own terms Philipse Upper Patent. That's where the clash came, starting in the early 1760s.
In 1758, his sister Mary was married here. Officiating the ceremony was a Reverend Henry Barclay, who was the head priest at Trinity Church, Wall Street, which we have visited in prior episodes. Helping him officiate the marriage was Governor James Delancey, who happened to be the uncle of Oliver Delancey, our lodge's second master. One of the groomsmen was John Watts, who was the father of John Watts Jr., who is buried down in Trinity Wall Street, who was also one of our early members. She married a Colonel Roger Morris. They would move to Manhattan and they would build what is now today known as the Morris Jamal House. It is the oldest residential structure standing in Manhattan. Frederick Philipse and family had a bunch of slaves working for them, and one was a slave by the name of Angevine, who was his butler, and he had a son by the same name. Later, that son would become the sexton at St. John's Church in downtown Getty Square, and he would tell quite the story about Mary Philipse' wedding.
While they were feasting, a tall Indian, closely wrapped in a scarlet blanket, appeared at the door of the banquet hall, and with measured words said, "Your possessions shall pass from you when the eagle shall despoil the lion of his mane."
So today, no matter where you stand throughout Westchester County or the Bronx, whether you're in downtown Yonkers or the concrete jungle of South Bronx, or even some beautiful tree-lined street here in one of the more upscale neighborhoods of Westchester County, chances are if you were there standing 200 years ago, 250 years ago, you're standing on farmland. And that's virtually impossible for us to picture today, but it's the truth. This was all rolling hills of farmland. Now, this land was mostly owned by wealthy landowners like Frederick Philipse. And generally speaking, these landowners had inherited their wealth because they descended from European royal families. So there was a large disparity between those working the land, those building the houses and tilling the soil, and those who actually owned the land. And those tensions kind of boiled over in the 1760s, pre-American Revolution.
The unrest began in the early 1760s when many men from the Hudson Valley went off to fight the French, and so did many Native Americans. The Wappingers, under their leader at that time, a man named Daniel Nimham, went off at Sir William Johnson's request and at King George II's request to fight the French, starting in 1756, 1757. While they were away, they took their women, children, and elders to their kinfolk and friends in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where there was a Mohican mission village, and they left them there for safekeeping. And so while these lands were not under direct personal Wappinger control, they had the heirs to the Philipse claim and the Philipse upper patent, Beverly Robinson, who married a Philipse, and Roger Morris, who married a Philipse, and Frederick Philipse himself moved in a big way into the land and claimed it as their own. When the Wappingers returned from war and discovered that this land had been seized from them, they then began to look for ways to get the land back. At the same time as this was happening, these landlords began to change the terms, the fairly loose and generous arrangements that the tenant farmers had had before that point. For example, a tenant who lived on a farm and who had built a house, built a barn, put up fences, obviously before undoing any of this, cleared trees, planted an orchard. Before that, the tenant had the right, I think with the landlord's permission, but it probably varied, to sell his tenancy to another farmer and to include in that sale the cost of his improvements to get some profit for that. These landlords wanted shorter leases, they wanted higher rates, and in some cases they wanted to not give a tenant farmer the right to getting paid for the improvements that he had put in. This was very upsetting to a lot of families who had and they put it in these exact terms, that we put our blood, sweat, and tears into this farm, and now it's all being taken away from us.
I am going to link the full interview I did with Professor James Merrill from Vassar in the description. I can't thank him enough. He really was just a fountain of information. He was very generous of his time, and I greatly appreciate that. Nothing to me illustrates the power differential dynamic that existed in the colonies prior to the American Revolution better than the Tenant riots and the case of the Stockbridge Indians. Now, just imagine this. These men left their homes in Putnam County. They bring their women and children to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. They go and fight for king and country, and after the war's over, they come back and they find their land is all gone and pretty much stolen by Frederick Philipse and family. Now, it gets worse because they fight this very long, lengthy battle in the court system here in New York. They don't get anywhere. They even take their case overseas. They get in a boat. Nimham gets in a boat, goes to London, brings his case before king and court, pretty much wins there, but when he comes back, there's no support for him, and they get nowhere. They never get their land back. They never get compensated for their land. So when the American Revolution breaks out, what side of the war do you think they're going to fight on? I think the choice is pretty obvious. Right along Tuckahoe Road in Yonkers is the Sherwood House, right by the southbound entrance to the Sprainbrook Parkway. This was built by Thomas Sherwood. Thomas was a tenant farmer under Frederick Philipse. Now just imagine putting all the sweat equity into the farm and building a building like this, only to have your overlord say, you know what, you don't really own that. You own nothing. Be happy. I would not be happy. I'm sure you wouldn't be either. Now, two side notes that are interesting to me. Tuckahoe Road is one of the widest roads in Westchester County, and it's that way because of George Washington. He ordered that road to be widened because it was strategically important. It was the main thoroughfare up from Kingsbridge, and it was Thomas Sherwood and I believe his brother who were some of the workmen who widened this road back then. Our lodge has a direct connection to the Sherwood family, in that one of their descendants, Right Worshipful Bob Warhill, was the past master of two of our legacy lodges, Westchester 702 as well as Marble Stort Wynyah 702. Now, he was a Mason's Mason. I knew him personally. He was senior deacon at my third degree, and I pretty much knew him my whole life. He was just a wonderful guy. He is surely missed, and he is buried here at St. John's Church, Tuckahoe. And this church was founded after the American Revolution as a satellite to St. John's Getty Square for those parishioners who lived on this side of Yonkers, and it was difficult for them to travel to the other side. That said, many interesting things happened right here during the American Revolution. First off, in fall of 1776, prior to the Battle of White Plains, none other than Lord Stirling was stationed up here, most likely with Mordecai Gist at the time. On October 6, 1777, the British would attack Forts Montgomery and Fort Clinton on the Hudson River, not far from where Bear Mountain Bridge is today. They did this as a diversionary tactic to draw troops away from General Burgoyne, who was trying to secure the northern part of the Hudson River at the time. That following day, Burgoyne would face off against the Americans at the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans would obviously be victorious. Now, we've talked a bit about the Queen's Rangers, John Simcoe and Banastre Tarleton. We haven't really spoken much about Andreas Emmerich. One of the units that attacked Forts Montgomery and Clinton that day were Emmerich's chasseurs. Now, he was briefly mentioned earlier in the video, but I think it's really important that we understand who Andreas Emmerich was, what his troops were about, because they were one of the key players at the Battle of Kingsbridge. Now, we have interviews by McDonald describing who Andreas Emmerich was as a person. And one of those interviews is by a gentleman by the name of Philemon Fowler. Now, Philemon was one of the founding brothers of Westchester Lodge 46.
Emmerich was a severe disciplinarian and often whipped his men for disobedience and plundering, and sometimes would draw his sword and beat them with a flat. He would sometimes be excited and cry after punishing them, declaring he did it all for their good. He not infrequently patrolled along here in Eastchester.
Under Emmerich's command was a Captain Joshua Barnes. And that following January, Joshua Barnes and his troops were coming from Tarrytown back to return to Kingsbridge. And about a quarter mile ahead of them, they located about 200 American troops. So they stealthily climbed up this hill here, what is known as Colonial Heights today, to kind of work a way around them. Unfortunately, they were surrounded by American troops and they were taken prisoner. Barnes would face a court-martial in 1779 for his actions around the raid on Forts Montgomery and Clinton. He was accused of cowardice and also pillaging from local residents. He would be acquitted of these charges. Emmerich's original unit was composed of men that were drafted from other units such as the Queen's Rangers. And they are the ones who had such great success attacking Forts Montgomery and Clinton. So much so that Emmerich received a promotion in 1778, as well as permission to expand his corps, which he did in 1778 prior to the Kingsbridge Massacre. Now, he would do so by aggressively recruiting local partisans from right here in Westchester County. He also got some from New York City and even Long Island. But given Emmerich's personality, it should come as no surprise to anyone that eventually his unit would fall into serious mutiny. The disarray would get so bad that Clinton would dissolve Emmerich's chasseurs, strip Emmerich of his command, sending all the men back out to other units. Emmerich would hang around Kingsbridge doing really nothing of significance. Eventually he would move back to Germany, and he would achieve some notoriety and success during Napoleonic Wars, in which he would be killed in an attempt to abduct Jerome Bonaparte, who had been put on the throne of Westphalia by none other than Napoleon himself. Right off the Sprainbrook Parkway, along Grasslands Road or Route 100, a very busy road. You'll hear traffic in the background as I speak. It's got 3 lanes on each side. Rests this monument erected in 1923 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Time has really passed this monument by. It's virtually inaccessible. The road is very busy and there's almost no parking in the area. This was dedicated to the lives lost in the bitter winter of 1780 at the Battle of Young's House. Now, Joseph Young's house was in the neighborhood known as the Four Corners, a neighborhood that is memorialized in James Fenimore Cooper's book about the American Revolution called The Spy. And Joseph Young's house was attacked multiple times during the American Revolution, including in 1778 by 32 men that Andreas Emmerich sent out of his chasseurs to steal Joseph Young's cattle and those of his Whig neighbors. Now, fortunately for Young, his son Samuel was in the neighborhood chopping wood and heard of the British approaching. He quickly ran to the home of Sergeant John Dean. Together they organized an ambush from behind a stone wall, and when Emmerich's men were on their way back, they ambushed them. The ambush was successful, and they wound up chasing Emmerich's chasseurs almost 2 miles to Elmsford, where Sam's Club is today. Of the 32 men Andreas Emmerich sent out, only 1 survived. Now, this raid typifies the kind of action that the British troops operating in neutral ground did throughout the American Revolution. A point of fact is James Delancey's Cowboys. They received pay for only 51 days of service, yet they were able to sustain themselves through 7 years of war by pillaging from their neighbors. If you study the American Revolution even lightly, you're quickly presented with a familiar story. The Americans outsmarting the British by employing guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding behind stone walls and trees, taking shots and inept British troops wearing bright red coats, lining up in long lines of battle according to European standards. Now, here is something rarely mentioned. The British had a disdain for the unconventional, cowardly way that the Americans fought. But the real truth is, when the Americans could field a full army to face the British head-on in the traditional way, they most certainly did. And then there's the British. They were absolute masters of unconventional or guerrilla warfare, or as they called it, partisan warfare. They employed these tactics throughout neutral ground for the entire war. You see, they recruited, trained, and deployed locals. not on the front lines, but behind the lines using unconventional warfare. And this is exactly what the Green Berets are trained to do today. So I wonder, with his temperament, would Andreas Emmerich make it all the way through Green Beret training to Robin's Age? I highly doubt it. But these men did more to advance the strategies and tactics of guerrilla warfare for future generations than anyone on the American side did. The truth is, they were absolute masters of guerrilla warfare, and they employed these tactics in the neutral ground for the entire time of the war. Four of the leaders that day at the Stockbridge Massacre would write about partisan warfare. Johann Ewald, who led the contingent of Hessians, would write a treatise on partisan warfare. Andreas Emmerich would write a booklet called The Partisan in War. And both Simcoe and Tarleton would write memoirs bragging about the strategies and tactics and their successes they brought them throughout the war. All these books were published. And then you look at the founder of the Rangers themselves, Robert Rogers. He published his journals in 1765, and those journals are still studied today. These tactics would reappear during the American Civil War. In 1862, the Confederate Congress would pass the Partisan Ranger Act, and this would give birth to some of the most notorious Confederate names that you've heard. Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Singleton Mosby, and of course William Quantrell and his Raiders, which included Bloody Bill Anderson, Frank and Jesse James, and Jim and Cole Younger. Now those four men, after the war, would use these very tactics to hold up banks, rob stagecoaches and trains, and then they would vanish into thin air. You see, the leaders of the British forces here on neutral ground cast a very long shadow. We are now about 11 miles north of Philipse Manor Hall in Yonkers, and I am standing next to the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow. Directly across the street from us is Philipsburg Manor. And on that site is a mill that used to be owned by the Philipse family. You see, the Philipse family had multiple businesses. They had multiple streams of income. Not only did they make money from renting land, they also ran mills, etc. They took part of that wealth and they actually built this church. Most of you are familiar with the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman. It was Washington Irving who wrote that. Irvington is named after him, and it is set right here at the Old Dutch Church. Washington Irving based the legend of Sleepy Hollow on an actual folktale that had been told for many years in the Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow area, and that was of a mounted Hessian soldier who lost his head during the Battle of White Plains to a cannonball. Now, the Hessians crossed the Bronx River, which is behind the camera here, to attack Washington's flank up on Chatterton Hill, which is behind us here. This is a monument to that battle. This cannon here rests along the southbound entrance to the Bronx River Parkway. Obviously, the parkway wasn't there back during the Battle of White Plains. It was Alexander Hamilton who was in charge of the artillery during the battle, hence we have Hamilton Avenue in White Plains. Now the legend goes that the body of this Hessian was brought up to the graveyard at the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow, and at night he would arise in search of his head. Now Washington Irving took this folktale and turned it into one of the best short stories in American literature. Now, we're not even here because of this. We're here because buried on the grounds of this church's cemetery is one of the most important men who served Westchester County during the American Revolution. And he is also the father-in-law of one of the founding members of Westchester Lodge 46. Buried here at the Old Dutch Church is Bishop Underhill, one of the founding members of Huguenot Lodge 46, and his wife Nancy. Now, Bishop was the nephew of Lord Underhill, the same Lord Underhill we talked about in an earlier episode, who was arrested along with Jonathan Fowler and Samuel Seabury. Now, Bishop married Nancy Odell, became Nancy Underhill. Now, her father was a very important person within the American Revolution in Westchester County. Lying here next to Bishop Underhill and his wife Nancy is Nancy's father, and that would be Colonel John Odell. Now, John Odell served an elite unit of scouts known as the Westchester Guides during the Revolution. Also lying here would be his brother Abraham and his brother-in-law James McChain. Those men also served with John Odell and the Westchester Guides. However, it was John Odell who really stood out in this group, and this is something I just learned from the McDonald Papers. Around 1778, the notorious outlaw of the Bronx, who ran the Cowboys, or the Delancey refugees, James Delancey, the brother of our second master Oliver, came to John Odell. Now, this alone just illustrates how different the Skinners were from the Cowboys. There was a bit of gentlemanness to the Cowboys, as notorious as they were. However, Delancey went to Odell and said, look, you're hated by my men. Can't stand you. You've got to get out of Westchester. I can't control my men. It's not only your life in danger, but also the lives of your family and friends. So rather than put his family and friends in peril, John left. He didn't leave the war. What he did was he went and he joined the New York levies. And if you remember from earlier episodes, the New York levies were run by none other than Marinus Willett. Now, this is where the story gets a little more crazy, because his second in command was none other than Captain John McKinstry. And if you remember from earlier episodes, John McKinstry was the brother whose life was saved by Joseph Brant during the Battle of the Cedre, or the Siege of Quebec. He was also one of the brothers who founded Hudson Lodge, where Gideon Coggeshall was made a Mason. And Gideon obviously was the first master of Huguenot or Westchester Lodge 46. This is mind-blowing to me, the connections. It was such a small world. And as I discover them, I just go, wow, it's crazy. We are right in the area where the original Kingsbridge stood, next to the Marble Hill Playground. It's no longer here. The Spuyten Duyvil Creek that it crossed has been filled in. They did that to create the Harlem River Ship Canal. That created an oddity in New York City geography, because in front of us is Manhattan and behind us is the Bronx, even though this whole area is landlocked to the Bronx. Now, the Kingsbridge was originally built by Frederick Philipse, who would be Frederick Philipse III's grandfather, and it was another profitable venture for the Philipse family, because they would collect tolls of everyone going back and forth on this. Now, this area during the American Revolution was heavily guarded by heavy British troops, because it was pretty much the front line for the British. Everything north of here was contested or neutral ground. A little further north than that, it was the exclusive area of the Patriots. We are at Redmond Field in Yonkers, not far from Miles Square Road. This used to be part of the Miles Square neighborhood. Now, the only thing that remains today of the Miles Square neighborhood would be Miles Square Road, which is a windy and somewhat busy road that runs from Valentine Hill and down into Mount Vernon. We are at the intersection of Sherwood Avenue and Bronx River Road. Now, back in July of 1778, John Graves Simcoe had received word that there was a contingent of American troops on the Mount Vernon side of the Bronx River, and he decided he wanted to set a trap, an ambush, an ambuscade. So what he did was he hid troops in the woods across on the Yonkers side that were there to ambush him, and he marched a contingent of British troops, a small contingent, just enough to tempt the Americans to attack. And indeed they did. They crossed the bridge over the Bronx River. However, the Americans noticed one of the British officers in the woods as he went up on a fence to catch a glimpse of what was happening. They realized it was an ambush. They turned the cannons on the troops in the woods, and those troops fled. By 1826, Freemasonry had grown quite significantly in Westchester County. So much so that there was an Abundance Brothers on the western portion of the county, and it was quite difficult for them to get to the Westchester Lodge 46 meetings. So with the full backing and support of our lodge, they petitioned Grand Lodge to form their own lodge. That lodge would become Rising Star Lodge number 450. And it was Deputy Grand Master Richard Hatfield who would officiate at their first meeting. That lodge would go on to build a beautiful Masonic temple at South Broadway in Yonkers. That building was designed by the same architect who designed the Wrigley building in Chicago. In its heyday, that building would host 5 different Masonic lodges, comprising of roughly 1,400 to 1,500 members, Rising Star Lodge being the largest of them, with just shy of 800 members in its heyday. Now, in 1897, this lodge erected this beautiful monument in Oakland Cemetery. Cemetery. Now, Oakland Cemetery is in the center of Yonkers, just adjacent to St. John's Cemetery and across the street from what was the old Alexander Smith carpet factory. If you walk these grounds today, you will come across the graves of many, many Masonic brothers, including my grandfather and great-grandfather. Now, interestingly, my great-grandfather was a member of Rising Star Lodge when they built that Masonic temple in Yonkers. Rising Star Lodge was also the sponsor of my DeMolay chapter, the Yonkers DeMolay, and we actually used to meet in that building way back when. So what does all this have to do with the American Revolution? Well, turn the clock back to 1778. This cemetery was not here. This was all bucolic farmland. None of these buildings were here. It was simply a valley surrounded by hills. And it was Brother Mordecai Gist and his troops that were camped out right here during the events of the Stockbridge Massacre. Now, in addition to the various Masonic brothers' graves that you can come across in these cemeteries, over on the St. John's side, there are quite a few veterans of the American Revolution who are buried there as well. Buried here in St. John's Cemetery are over 20 men who served as soldiers in the American Revolution, two of whom served with John Odell as Westchester guides. A Garrett Garrison and an Andrew Corsa. Also buried here is a former Hessian soldier by the name of Peter Anton Wolfe. Now, Wolfe either just left and deserted, or he switched sides. But he did spend the remainder of his life in Pelham, New York. And if you're from Pelham or you're familiar with Pelham, you know there's a Wolfe's Lane there. And indeed, it is named after him. During that time period, this land was owned by St. John's Church. It was bequeathed to them by Frederick Philipse II in 1751, who also paid for the construction of the St. John's Church, and it became the parsonage for the priest of the church. And during the American Revolution, Reverend Isaac Babcock and his wife Grace lived here. In December of 1776, Isaac Babcock signed the Declaration of Dependence, firmly casting his lot with king and country and rejecting the American Revolution. As a result, he was arrested by the Continentals and held captive till the fall of 1777. Now, according to church lore, upon his return to the parsonage, on the steps, he collapsed and died. And this made Grace Babcock the new widow Babcock. Apparently, according to the testimony of Rebecca Tompkins Odell, who is related to the same family that Odell Avenue is named for, she was quite the handsome woman. So, as an attractive woman, she was pursued by officers on both sides of the conflict. So Mordecai Gist had with him his first cousin, Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was about 10 years older than Mordecai. Apparently, he was quite smitten with the widow Babcock to the point where he proposed marriage to her. According to Rebecca Tompkins Odell, who referred to Nathaniel Gist as an old man at 45 years old, the widow Babcock refused the marriage proposal because she felt that she didn't know him well enough. Nathaniel's father was Christopher Gist. Now, Christopher Gist is featured in a game called Assassin's Creed as one of the characters, a member of the Order of the Templars. And he was a personal friend of George Washington, having served with him in the wilderness during the French and Indian War. And apparently he saved Washington's life 2 times. Now, both Christopher and Nathaniel were friends with Daniel Boone. Yes, that Daniel Boone of Disney movie fame. We are back at Van Cortlandt Park. Now, during the American Revolution, this was all farmland owned by the DeVoe family. And this is where the Stockbridge Indians, Daniel Nimham and his son Abraham, lost their lives. This monument is dedicated to Chief Nimham and the Stockbridge, who lost their lives that day at the Battle of Kingsbridge. It rests along Van Cortlandt Park East. Directly across the street from us is another memorial park that sits at Oneida Avenue, East 238th Street. Where we're standing, this area was Indian Field where they lost their lives. I was unable to locate any of the orders that George Washington gave to Mordecai Gist as to why he was stationed down at the Babcock Parsonage, but to me it's pretty obvious why he was there. He had with him John Odell, one of the Westchester guides, a very well-known scout. He also had that contingent of Stockbridge Indians who he sent ahead to kind of reconnoiter the Kingsbridge area. Now, Native Americans have been used as scouts throughout the American Civil War and the American Revolution, just because culturally many of the tribes, these men grew up in cultures of hunting and also tribal warfare. And both of these disciplines require you to be excellent at scouting. After the Battle of Kingsbridge, some of the locals noticed that the stray dogs in the area were running around with human remains. They came across Daniel Nimham's body, which had pretty much been completely chewed up by them. So they went around and they collected all the remains that were still above ground, and they buried them, covered them with stones. So I find it sad, disrespectful, and insensitive that next to this beautiful monument to these brave soldiers for the American cause, that the city of New York in its infinite wisdom would place a dog park right next to the monument to the Stockbridge soldiers. This is a map of the battlefield at the Stockbridge Massacre drawn by John Graves Simcoe himself. You can see the Stockbridge troops marching onto the field. Below them to the right is Andreas Emmerich in the woods, kind of pushed them out into the open field and corralling them. Laying in wait ahead are 2 units of cavalry, and they are supported by 3 units of the Queen's Rangers behind them. Now, the British Legion and Banastre Tarleton lay in wait behind, getting ready to sweep the field. And from here, it's very easy for Andreas Emmerich to come in behind the Stockbridge troops, encircle them, and closing the trap. Now, Simcoe does draw 2 friendly units to the north. I don't know whether those are just men or not.
At the ambuscade of Nimham, Colonel Emmerich was deliberately fired at by an Indian and narrowly escaped by ducking his head, the ball hitting his hat. The Indians passed by my father's down the Sawmill River Road the day before. They were surprised and cut to pieces.
Now, this is a modern-day painting by the artist Don Troiani, and he was kind enough to allow me to share this. Now, Don is a highly respected artist, and I think you can see why by looking at this image. He is known for historical accuracy and stunning realistic detail. In fact, some of his work hangs in places such as the Museum of the American Revolution. And if you look at this image, I really believe he captures the essence of what happened that day on the fields in the Bronx. You could see the Stockbridge Indians just being surrounded and completely overwhelmed, and it was an absolute rout. Stockbridge lost 40 men that day, whereas the British troops only lost 1 cavalryman and had 3 wounded soldiers. It was a massacre. We are standing in what most people call Tippet's Brook Park. Originally it was Tippet with 2 P's because it was named for George Tippet, who purchased land that this brook flowed through back in 1688. Now, this body of water was called Mooshulu by the Native Americans, and this is where we get Mooshulu Parkway from. Battle of Kingsbridge, several of the Stockbridge were able to retreat and escape, and they did so along this creek. They hid along the banks in some of the woods, and the Queen's Rangers caught up to them, and they yelled out to them, said, "Hey, look, just come out, reveal yourself, we'll give you a quarter." 3 made that mistake, and the Queen's Rangers just mowed them down. To me, that's the most horrific part of this whole battle, just that one incident. Now, a man by the name of Job would survive the slaughter that day, and he would live into a ripe old age. Anytime he was asked about that fateful day, he would well up in tears. He would also relate a story about Daniel Nimham being on the field of battle, yelling to the others, "Don't worry about me, I'm old, I will die here." And that he did. A very, very sad day for the Stockbridge Muncie people. Now, in mid-September of 1778, the British troops started to appear on the hills surrounding the American troops. I'm talking Banastre Tarleton, John Graves Simcoe, and Andreas Emmerich. The Americans started to panic because they knew they were not only outmaneuvered, they were quite outnumbered by the British. So we are atop one of the hills in Oakland Cemetery. And most certainly there were some British troops up here that day in 1778. It's an amazing vantage point. You can see the entire valley below, the lower section of the cemetery where that Rising Star Lodge monument is. You can actually even see the Palisades from up here across the Hudson River. Next to us are the grave sites of the Ludlow family and the Otis family. And if you're a Yonkers native, you're going to recognize both these last names, Ludlow from Ludlow Street and Otis from Otis Elevator. If you're not a Yonkers native, it's hard to appreciate just how hilly this city is. It is known as the City of Seven Hills, though I beg to argue with that because it has a few more hills than seven. But nevertheless, it's a very hilly city. The widow Babcock, that fateful day when the British were surrounding these positions here, she took a handkerchief and she waved it from the parsonage to warn the troops. So while Nathaniel Gist never got the love of his life from that relationship, at least she saved his life that day. Through cool, seasoned leadership, John Odell led the troops along what was the Sawmill River. You can't even see it anymore, kind of concealing themselves in the thicket along the river, up to what is known as Hog Hill back then. It's now Ashburton Avenue. Well, most of the Gist men were able to escape that day with the guidance of John Odell through the thicket along the Sawmill River. Some were not so lucky.
Emmerich took some of Gist's men prisoners and burnt the huts at Mrs. Babcock's. Captain Smith, I believe, belonged to Gist's.
After their retreat from the grounds of the Babcock parsonage, Mordecai Gist and his troops made their way over here to the Sherwood house. For stationed here was Benjamin Tallmadge. George Washington had sent Benjamin into neutral ground to gather intelligence. And if you've seen the series Turner, you know anything about the Culper Spy Ring, you know that he was the head of it and that he would go on to become George Washington's de facto head of intelligence for the entire Continental Army. The events that happened here would make for a wonderful Western movie. Just imagine Lee Van Cleef playing James Delancey, the head of the Cowboys. Perhaps John Wayne or Clint Eastwood playing John Odell. Would really make for a great movie. And now you know the story behind the man portrayed in this statue on Route 52 in Fishkill, New York, Daniel Nimham.